Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg, and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, the US decision to pause a bomb shipment to Israel because of concerns over its incursion into Rafah. Does this mark a U-turn in relations between Washington and Jerusalem? A US spokesman, speaking on condition of anonymity, has said that Israel hasn't, quote, fully addressed its concerns over the needs of around 1 million civilians sheltering in Gaza's southernmost city. Many people have fled there because of Israel's assault on other parts of Gaza, which it launched in retaliation for the October the 7th attacks, in which around 1,200 people died. Around 35,000 Palestinians are thought to have lost their lives since in the conflict. Let's welcome David Waring. David is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex and an expert on UK foreign relations in the Middle East. So, David, the bomb shipment, it's quite a considerable amount of potentially devastating weaponry. Does pausing it make any difference on the ground in Gaza?
It's more of a signal, I guess. After all, we're talking about a pause of the supply of some munitions, not a cessation of military supplies, full stop. The specific munitions that they're pausing the supply of are the really, really big bombs, like the 2,000-pound bombs that you just can't use with any kind of accuracy if you drop them in places like Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. I mean, they should never have been using those bombs to begin with. It's a message, I guess, from the Americans to the Israelis that they have some disquiet about this attack on Rafah, but it's pretty feeble. The Israelis, we have to remember, are fundamentally dependent on American military support to carry out these operations. They do have a military industry of their own, but it's deeply tied in with the Americans. I mean, Israel would not be the military power it is today without American military aid and military supplies. And the Americans have the ability to pull the plug on this assault on Gaza entirely. They've had that ability for 6 or 7 months, and they've allowed it to continue. So it's a small, weak, belated signal rather than a material pulling of the plug on this ongoing indiscriminate assault on Gaza.
The United States doesn't have any, it seems to me anyway, interest in stopping Israel making these incursions into Gaza, does it? I mean, it has not objected to Israel's retaliation per se, but it has latterly, perhaps belatedly, started voicing its concerns about the scale of the devastation, which has been truly horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the interests and how they balance out from the point of view of Washington, and this is true in the UK as well, there's the initial interest, which kicks in at the start of this current round of hostilities, which is to support your strategic ally, Israel, in its attempt to push back against its foes in the region, in this case Hamas, in other moments Iran, back them to the hill and make sure that they prevail. Then your interest can evolve, because it may be that the political costs of doing that become prohibitive or concerning. So the humanitarian impact in Gaza of Israel's war has elicited a bit of political blowback in the United States, increasing disquiet, protests on university campuses, other forms of protest, and an election coming up for Biden, which he could quite easily lose to Donald Trump. On that side, they have an interest in stopping it. They're losing support in the global south. They're losing diplomatic support throughout the world. The United States, there's a lot of opposition to what they're doing in terms of supporting the Israelis. And that makes it harder for them to fight their kind of new Cold War with Russia and China. So they've got these things pushing in different directions. And at the moment, they're still sitting on the side of carrying on supporting Israel and trying to contain the political fallout or blowback from that. But it's going to get harder and harder for them as this goes on.
But the message then of pausing this bomb shipment to Netanyahu is, we've told you we don't want you to launch this incursion into Rafah. Israel has clearly ignored that, albeit that perhaps the pace of that incursion has been less rapid than it might have been. After this point, what else can the United States do? It seems to me almost unthinkable that the United States, based on what we know of its history and its relationship with Israel, that it would say, well, that's it. We are not going to back you. I cannot imagine a scenario in which that would happen. Can you?
Well, we don't have to imagine the scenario because the Americans have yanked the chain on Israel before. This has happened, in 1982 when Israel attacked Lebanon. Ronald Reagan called up the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Begin, and told him it had to stop, and it stopped. And in previous rounds of fighting in Gaza, the basic script is it carries on until the Americans tell the Israelis to stop. The last time there was fighting over Gaza or Israeli bombing of Gaza a couple of years ago, it carried on for, I think, about a week or so, 10 days, something like that. And then Biden told Netanyahu, okay, game's up, you have to stop. And you can think of many instances when the Americans have exerted their power over Israel or simply ignored Israel. In the early 1990s, it was the Americans that forced the Israeli government to the negotiating table by withholding loan guarantees. When Barack Obama signed the nuclear deal with the other major powers in Iran towards the end of his presidency, the Israelis were dead set against this. Netanyahu constantly lobbied against it. The pro-Israel lobby in the United States made a huge noise about it. And Obama just ignored them because he saw it as being in America's strategic interest to sign this deal with Iran. And so it's not the case that Israel, a country with a population of 8 or 9 million people, whatever it is, has the United States, a country with a population of 300 million people, the greatest superpower the world has ever seen, the world's greatest military power, that Israel has the United States over a barrel. That's not the case. The Americans have backed the Israelis to an extraordinary degree because they see it as being in their interest to do so. And they simply don't have that much concern for the humanitarian costs of this war.
Sorry, David, just to interrupt you there, because I think this is a really interesting insight then, particularly when people have seen the horrific scale of the retaliation visited upon children and non-combatants in Gaza. We also acknowledge the horrific nature of the October the 7th attacks. But when you look at the horrific scale of the retaliation, then your argument really is that the United States could have stopped this way, way, way before now and has chosen strategically not to.
Yeah, they could have stopped it any time they like. I mean, this isn't new. When you think about the way American power has exerted itself over the years, support for military operations that carry enormous humanitarian costs, either doing that yourself or backing an allied state while it does that sort of thing. It's not uncommon. You think about the Saudi war in Yemen that was waged between 2015 and 2022. It was very similar. Indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets, apparent use of starvation as a war tactic, blockade, creating a humanitarian crisis entirely deliberately, people dying of starvation or preventable disease as a result. That's how the Saudis fought that war for 7 years. And the Americans helped them throughout, provided the missiles, bombs, maintained the jets that they were using to carry out that war. The British did exactly the same, by the way, throughout that period. And you can go on, endlessly about wars that have been fought by the US or by the US's allies with its support and with British support as well, where there's been an enormous humanitarian cost. We're paying a particular amount of attention to Gaza because it's particularly horrific. And also, I think Israel-Palestine has been more on people's radars increasingly over the decades as people have become more aware of and more educated about the situation there. But this isn't anything particularly new. The kind of strategic imperatives from the point of view of Washington of backing its allies in any given circumstance are just consistently treated as overriding humanitarian concerns. I'm sure that policymakers in Washington have very nice stories that they can tell themselves about why this stuff is okay. And they're the same stories that they tell the rest of us, that Israel is making every effort to abide by international law and Israel is defending itself, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it's the fundamental reality. The Americans can pull the plug on this sort of thing. Israel is militarily dependent on the Americans, but the Americans see Israel prevailing in this situation militarily as more important than any humanitarian cost that might be incurred, except insofar as that humanitarian cost creates political problems for the Americans. Once that becomes true, then you see what we've seen over the more recent months, which is a degree of kind of performative hand-wringing over the humanitarian situation in Gaza and a degree of difference between the Americans and the Israelis, where there's less pressure, I mean, there's no pressure domestically on the Israelis to treat the Palestinians more kindly. Whereas on Biden, there's domestic political pressure on him to alleviate the humanitarian situation. So he has to balance that from a political point of view. But I mean, that's it. Any instinct to protect Palestinians is forced on them by political pressure. And the same is true in Britain as well.
I want to talk about the strategic value of Israel to the United States. But first, let me just pull back a moment. You've talked about the ability of the United States to stop this conflict should it wish to do so. And you've quoted various incidents in the past where they have successfully done so. Isn't the joker in the pack this time Benjamin Netanyahu? He knows that if there is peace in Gaza, there will be almost inevitably two consequences. One is that his own government will fall. It only survives really because of the war footing on which Israel is currently standing. And also that he faces a corruption trial, which may lead to him going to prison. So he has this very strong personal investment in peace not breaking out. And we've seen recently, haven't we, peace talks foundering, with Israel seemingly finding reasons not to accede to peace negotiations.
Yeah, that's a factor for sure. But it's not one that should be overstated. I think it is important. And all the more reason for the Americans, if they really want or wanted to stop this, to use additional pressure beyond just pausing the supply of some arms, ceasing the provision of all arms, precisely because you have Benjamin Netanyahu in such an intransigent position because of his own personal circumstances. But we shouldn't overplay it. He's not a dictator. There's a wider cabinet around him, and it's not just the people to his right who are agitating for this kind of maximal strategy. I mean, you have to remember that the attack on October 7th last year wasn't just a humiliation for Netanyahu, it was a humiliation for the entire military and security establishment in Israel. All this big talk about how the Palestinian situation was contained from their point of view, about Israel's military prowess, about its ability to repress the Palestinians with high technology, sort of security systems, etc. It was just made to look stupid when they broke through the fence or paraglided over the fence and then held territory in Israel for a couple of days, these paramilitaries. And so there's a general incentive beyond Netanyahu going right through the security establishment and senior figures like the defense minister, etc., for them to reassert their credibility, to inflict a punishment beating on the Palestinians as a whole, and to reassert their sort of intimidatory capacity, their ability to say to their enemies, don't try it on, or this is what we can do. So, if it wasn't Netanyahu, I suspect that Israel will be carrying on like this anyway, because the entire establishment has an interest in pursuing this. There's pressure from a large proportion of the Israeli public to cut a deal with Hamas.
Demonstrations on the streets for Netanyahu to come to a deal so that the hostages can be released. I mean, this is one of the horrible ironies of this situation, is the terror that has been rained down upon Gaza has not led to the release of all the hostages, which is one of the declared war aims of Netanyahu.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if they wanted the hostages released, they could have done it ages ago. They could have just negotiated quite easily. I mean, the hostages have almost been treated as expendable. And I think that's the conclusion that many of these hostages' families and a significant proportion of the Israeli population seems to be coming to as well, that the government would rather fight the war than negotiate the release of their loved ones. Yeah, there is that pressure on the government. We have to remember as well that while there is that pressure to conclude a deal, there's been no pressure on the government from anywhere in the Israeli political spectrum to fight the war in a different way. According to polls, it's virtually unanimous amongst the entire Israeli Jewish population, at least, not the Palestinian population within Israel, that Israel's war tactics are justified. So there's always a slight danger with Israel of reducing the problem to Netanyahu. There's a bigger problem with the entire Israeli political class, quite frankly, and the military and security establishment. Action towards the Palestinians in this way isn't new, and it's not just a Netanyahu thing.
From the United States point of view, obviously an ally Israel has been attacked. Beyond that, what is the United States' greater strategic interest in the Middle East, and why is Israel so important to it?
The fundamental strategic value of the Middle East has been the oil heartlands of the planet, or the energy heartlands of the planet. And that was true before the Americans were a real presence in the Middle East. I mean, if you go right back to the late 19th, early 20th century, it became clear that the Middle East had enormous oil reserves. And this was a point when the world economy is industrializing and oil is becoming a kind of central energy source. And then, huge reserves of gas found there as well. It's difficult to overstate this. We're talking about, the last I checked, when I was doing my research on Britain's support for Saudi Arabia a few years ago, it was like 45% of proven oil reserves in the world were in the Middle East and clustered in quite a small area encompassing southern Iran, southern Iraq, northern Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc., etc. So this is the key value of the Middle East. Plus, it's at the kind of junction of Africa, Central and South Asia, and Southeastern Europe as well. So it's on a series of trade routes, but the energy factor is absolutely crucial. Now, Israel doesn't have energy reserves of that kind, but it's in that neighborhood and it's plugged into that wider system. If you want to exert power in a global system, it's important to have a presence in the energy heartlands of the planet. I'm speaking here from a kind of imperial strategic point of view. And it's important to have allies there. Now, amongst the majority Arab population, Western power is pretty unpopular. So you can have alliances with the likes of Saudi Arabia or Egypt, but you're reliant on dictators who are unpopular because the general population is against you. So those aren't the most reliable allies to have. Whereas with Israel, that alliance is much more solid. You've got an alliance with the government and warm relations with the general population as well. And so Israel has been built up by the Americans as a local military power, almost like as America's geostrategic and military enforcer in the region, and a uniquely reliable ally in an area which is strategically important to the Americans, but also quite hostile for various reasons. So that's been the kind of strategic logic going back to at least the 1960s, when the Americans really started forging their relationship with the Israelis. And once you've invested that much in a strategic relationship, it almost becomes reflexive that you back your ally. You back your ally, come what may, because you want to show that ally that you're a reliable patron. And you want to show your other allies around the world that you're a reliable patron. And you want to show your strategic adversaries around the world that you are committed to supporting your allies. So it becomes about so much more than just Israel. It becomes about strategic interests in the Middle East, strategic interests and strategic posture around the world more generally. And those interests override humanitarian concerns, and it can even override a degree of political blowback, as we're seeing.
Indeed. And on that, then, how significant is that blowback, these campus protests, which we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, but which are particularly aggressively policed in the United States, clearly taking up a huge amount of television time, lots of headlines and so on. Is that any kind of serious political threat to Biden, and particularly to his stance in relation to Israel and Gaza?
It is, because in a few months' time, there's going to be a presidential election in which, as Biden himself has acknowledged, democracy itself is on the ballot, because a Trump presidency isn't something that American democracy would necessarily survive. Trump's sort of fascist instincts are coming more and more to the fore. So it's a really dangerous moment. And I think Biden understands this. The wider sort of traditional American governing class understands what a perilous moment that is. And the last election, you have to remember, it was quite close. Joe Biden got more votes than any presidential candidate in history. But Donald Trump, in that same election, got more votes than any presidential candidate in electoral history other than Joe Biden. So there was a huge turnout on both sides. And the sort of margin of victory in a few battleground states was tiny, like a 4-figure number. And so it wouldn't take much for turnout on Biden's side to drop to a sufficient degree for Trump to win. Trump already won election just through the vagaries of the American electoral system. He won fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, but still squeaked through because of the way his vote was distributed. So this isn't a foregone conclusion by any means. It's quite a perilous moment. And what the protests show is that it's not just that this war is unpopular, and it's not just that members of the Democratic Voter Coalition are against the war. It's that a large number of young people are vociferously against the war. It's not just an opinion they hold passively. It's a position they're prepared to advocate for and prepared to take risks for. I mean, these students are incredibly brave. The extent to which they've braved police violence, the violence of far-right mobs who have attacked them at UCLA, the extent to which they're risking getting suspended, the damage to their future job prospects. They've shown enormous bravery and commitment. And if that carries through for the next few months, it makes things harder and harder for Biden. He has to conduct his electoral campaign against that backdrop. And he has to reckon with the fact that he's losing a generation of Americans. He needs young people to vote for him. They're a key constituency. And if this carries on, his presidency is in peril. And American democracy is in peril, which means the world is in peril if Donald Trump becomes president. So these really are the stakes at the moment. It's a huge problem.
David, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time. That's David Waring. He's a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline podcast. If you want to support our work, by the way, please take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly newspaper, which has the best of our online articles and stuff that you can't read anywhere else. So do head over to bylinetimes.com and take out a subscription. That's at bylinetimes.com. This has been a We Bring Audio production in Birmingham by me and Harvey White for the Byline Times. We'll see you again very soon. But for now, thanks for listening. Cheers now. Bye-bye.